Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. On this episode, we're diving into the ongoing events in the Russia-Ukraine war, specifically the claim that Russia has captured a grand total of, wait for it, 0.5% of Ukraine's territory in 2024. All that mobilization, propaganda, sanctions and heartbreak for this? Now, let's be clear, 0.5% of Ukraine's territory is not nothing. It is land, it is homes, it is farmland, it's people's lives. But the scale here is important, because if you believe the bombastic pronouncements coming out of certain Russian state media outlets, you would think these successes were proof of unstoppable might and historical destiny. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
2024 has been a rough year for the Ukrainian war effort. Although Kiev finally received permission to strike into Russian territory with Western-provided weapons, it has suffered losses elsewhere. November 2024 has seen Ukraine suffer its worst month since September 2022 when it comes to territory lost to Russia.
The pace of supply must become such as to disrupt the pace of Russian assaults. We need greater military strength and strong positions for diplomacy.
When you're in Zelensky's position and lose ground roughly the size of New York City in a single month, it is difficult to not emphasize the urgency of further military aid. Even if to some, these words seem hollow. Even if the war is exacting a heavy toll and morale is dropping like crumbling rocks off the edge of a sheer cliff.
We have to retreat due to the enemy's offensive actions. I often hear from the guys that this doesn't boost confidence or morale.
Most of Russia's gains have been in Donetsk. The region has been a focal point of the Russian campaign since the beginning of the invasion. But in other areas, Ukrainian forces have been holding ground. Kursk, another vital war theatre, continues to be contested and is seen as an important chip in any potential peace talks. Ukraine may have been losing battles in recent months, but its leadership shows unfading hope that in the end, victory will be theirs.
And now it's time to explore the issue in greater detail, so let's begin. As of 2024, the situation on the ground is drastically different from all that carefully manicured Russian propaganda. Instead of mighty leaps and unstoppable offensives, we seem to have something that more closely resembles a stalling car. One that's still going forward, sure, but only when it's rolling downhill and the clutch doesn't fail. Which leads us to the big question. If the conflict is just crawling along, why is the Kremlin so keen to proclaim victories? Because having a small success is often easier to message than acknowledging a failure. We only captured 0.5% of Ukraine's territory, but that's our 0.5%. That is a lot catchier than we have poured vast sums into a campaign that's hitting a giant geopolitical and logistical wall. And as always, in modern warfare, there is the dissonance between the illusions sold to the public and the grim reality for the actual soldiers on the field. For instance, it is widely reported that morale among troops is suffering, with many young Russians questioning why they're in Ukraine in the first place. The state official narrative doesn't really match what they see. Not glorious parades and swift campaigns, but a churn of resources and human lives. It begs the question, if the best claim the Kremlin can make is a handful of miles of territory, do they also hand out medals for smallest step forward? Perhaps there is an entirely new category of recognition. Underwhelming but not entirely zero progress. Or maybe the Tortoise Award for slow but somewhat steady advance. Everyone gets a trophy, right? Now, let's talk about the ramifications, because you can't just carve 0.5% out of a map without consequences. On the Ukrainian side, there is displacement, destruction of homes and farmland, disruption of supply routes, and heartbreak for families separated by newly drawn battle lines. If you're a Ukrainian farmer whose field just got turned into a muddy staging ground for Russian equipment, that 0.5% means 100% of your livelihood gone. If your home is caught in the crossfire, then your entire world has changed. Meanwhile, in Russia, the official line is that everything is under control. The economy is apparently strong enough to withstand Western sanctions. and the conflict is part of some grand historical necessity. But behind closed doors, bureaucrats are looking at budgets, supply chains, and a hemorrhaging sense of normalcy. Even in the face of adversity, the average citizen is forced to endure rising prices, restricted freedoms, and more propaganda than an infomercial that refuses to end. Consider the motivation problem. How do you convince volunteers, conscripts, or forced recruits that their sacrifices are worth risking their lives for? You can only wave the patriotic flag so long. At some point, the cost in human lives, in economic pain, in global standing, demands a new narrative that can rationalize such a meager territorial gain. And so, state officials rely on broad, epic-sounding justifications, laced with references to historical legacies and existential threats. So, where does that leave us in 2024? The fear is that if the bar for victory is so low, then anything that can be even remotely spun as an advance will be utilized for chest-thumping propaganda. That is a dangerous recipe for escalation and, frankly, for moral and political calamity. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Taras Kuzio, Professor of Political Science at the National University of the Kiev Mohyla Academy. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me.
So this has been a difficult year and a difficult month, in particular for Ukraine on the battlefield. But do you think that this negative trend can still be reversed?
Well, it's difficult to portray these battlefield developments in such a small kind of analysis, because, to be quite frank, Russia has been unable to advance in and retake huge amounts of territory. I mean, it's retaken very small bits of land at a huge casualty cost. The average daily casualty rate in the last month was something like 1,600. On some days, it went to over 2,200. That's killed and wounded, but of course, we know most Russian wounded die, or they're even killed by their own side. So, considering how many Russian soldiers are actually dying on the battlefield, they haven't actually regained much territory. And of course, the claims that they would very quickly retake back the Kursk region have proven to be false. So Ukraine, you could argue, if you were saying the glass is not half empty, the glass is half full, that Ukraine has actually held its ground quite well. What this entire year has shown is that Russia is unable to launch mass operations, sort of a mass offensives, as it were. It's simply unable to do that and to retake huge areas of territory. So the only way it can do this is by high levels of casualties, sort of meat assaults, as they're called in Russian, and of course attacks on civilian targets, energy infrastructure, this kind of thing. So on the whole, I would say Ukraine comes out of this relatively well. And I think, and we're probably going to be talking about this, looking to January when Donald Trump becomes US president, I think it's more likely to benefit Ukraine than Russia, but maybe we'll talk about that separately.
Putin actually had the audacity, if I may, he had the audacity to say, not only don't we care at all about Ukraine's accession into NATO being deferred by, say, 10 or 15 years, we want Ukraine never to be able to join NATO. But also, I mean, the most important part of that was we want regime change in Kiev. So, yes. Would the West, do you think the West will have, the capability of saying, okay, so who gave you the right of deciding who rules Ukraine? Because Ukraine is no longer a part of the Soviet Union or anything like that. It's a free country. What can we do about this sort of attitude towards negotiations? Clearly, Russia just isn't going anywhere with this, right?
Well, you're absolutely right. There's no way that the kind of chauvinistic, imperialistic arrogance towards Ukraine is likely to change in the Kremlin anytime soon. They claim, this is the audacity of a country that never has free elections in the last 25 years, is claiming that Zelensky is an illegitimate president. Of course, this is ridiculous. He was elected in a free election in 2019, and elections are not possible under Ukraine's constitution when there is martial law. So, of course, Russia will continue to promote this propaganda about regime change in Ukraine, because ultimately Russia wants is a Lukashenko-style little Russia, puppet state. This is what it wants for Ukraine. But that will never happen. It will never happen. Even if all American military aid ended tomorrow, and I somehow doubt this will be the case, even if it was to end tomorrow, Europeans would not allow this to happen, and Ukrainians would continue fighting.
Do you think the Europeans have enough capacity to help Ukraine in such a situation? Because there are many doubts as to whether Europe is willing and capable of making the necessary sacrifices. Like the percentage of GDP being spent by Western countries on NATO, not exactly the most impressive. That, by the way, was one of the points of contention between Europe and Trump in the very beginning.
Yes. No, of course, all of these factors are there. And when we say Europe, we mean specific countries. I think the countries that believe this war is existential to their own security, besides Ukraine, of course, are the 3 Baltic states, 4 Scandinavian countries, Britain, the Czech Republic, and Romania. So when I talk about the European countries that would not allow Ukraine to, as it were, be defeated, I'm talking about those countries. Other countries like Italy and or countries run by pro-Russian leaders like Slovakia and Hungary, of course, are irrelevant here. You're right that Trump has had a very positive influence on increasing defense spending in Europe. In 2014, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, only 5 NATO members spent 2% of GDP on defense. Today, it's about 2/3 of NATO members spend 2% more. Trump is talking that the minimum now should be not 2%, but 3%. So countries are going to have to increase. Poland is likely to be, I think, from next year, the highest spending military country in Europe, if it really goes up to 4% or even 5%. Britain is reaching 2.5 and plans to go to 3%. So, but the laggards, the 2 big populated countries which are the laggards, are of course Germany and France. Macron struts around Europe like a de Gaulle, but in fact, French military spending is just below 2%. So France needs to increase its military spending, and Germany especially, because it's the wealthiest country in the European Union.
France, on the other hand, has nuclear missiles, and it does actually have its own nuclear deterrent system that is independent from the US. So perhaps they think, okay, in terms of deterrence, well, we have this. We don't really have to think about increasing the spending by that much. But still, as you pointed out, this is a crucial thing, right? Whether Europe is capable of achieving that, whether that would be all of NATO or simply a coalition of the willing. Now, would you say that to some extent Russia is really playing into the hands of Trump and Ukraine by refusing to negotiate? If Trump sees there is no willingness to negotiate in good faith, would you say that he would be able to explain to his voters, well, you know, we tried our best, but we do have to arm Ukraine further because there is no other option there. Ukraine was willing to negotiate, Russia was not, so we have to win this. And we cannot afford to allow the collapse of Ukraine to take place.
Trump does not want to repeat Biden's mistake of Afghanistan in summer of 2021. That was a cloud that hung over Biden. It was chaotic, disastrous for America's image. It was actually one of the reasons why Russia invaded Ukraine, because it believed American power was now weak, or Western power was now weak. So Trump does not want the same kind of cloud hanging over him if he allows, say, Ukraine to be defeated. So it's not going to happen. The Trump so-called plans they're not plans, but proposals, are that if Russia does not agree to come to the negotiating table, then America will increase the amount of weapons it gives to Ukraine and take all the restrictions off the board. So actually, Russia's saying yet to negotiations and to peace proposals will work in Ukraine's favor. So I think this is actually, my prediction is that relations between Russia and the US, Trump and Putin, will deteriorate. I don't see how Russia can agree to any of these proposals because Russia's goals are simply incompatible with the kind of peace proposal. Russia wants the little Russianization of Ukraine. That's what it wants. It wants a little Russian puppet state controlled by Moscow, a Ukrainian Lukashenko sat in Kiev. And that simply would be impossible, I think, because Ukraine has always been different to Belarus, and Ukrainians would never accept it. But in Washington, they don't always really understand all of these nationalistic, imperialistic nuances that are in the Kremlin. So the Kremlin will never agree to the kinds of things coming out of Washington, and we've already heard this. So I'm more upbeat in many ways because we've had 3 years of Biden, which has been a drip supply of weapons, so enough for Ukraine not to be defeated, but not enough for Ukraine to win the war. Maybe this will now change on the battlefield. Remember, there is also 2 other factors coming into play in 2025. Firstly, the deteriorating economic financial situation in Russia. Simply, this cannot continue forever. The level of inflation and the financial crisis coming in Russia. Secondly, this high level of casualties, up to 2,000 a day, is simply impossible for it to continue indefinitely. And thirdly, Russia's running out of military equipment. It's been relying on Soviet stocks of tanks and armored personnel carriers, and these will run out by the end of 2025. Russia cannot produce enough each month to cover the ones it gets destroyed every month by Ukraine. Europe is picking up the kind of the baton, as it were, from the Americans. From January, there is a drone coalition in Europe, Poland, Scandinavian countries, Britain, which is going to be supplying Ukraine with huge amounts of drones. But Europe is not just having to produce weapons in its own countries and then send them to Ukraine. The new trend in the last year or so has been for countries, for example, Denmark's been in the lead here, to give Ukraine financial support, and then Ukraine builds military industrial capacity inside Ukraine and then builds those weapons itself. And that's actually, I think, a new trend. And Ukraine, therefore, is able to keep the technological advantage over Russia in this way.
Professor Taras Kuzio with a forecast going into 2025 and the options that Ukraine has to defeat Russia. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye for now.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Azerbaijan has accused Russia of trying to cover up last week's deadly plane crash. Vladimir Putin has apologized to the Azerbaijani president, but stopped short of taking responsibility for the incident.
In addition to accusing Moscow of attempting to conceal the cause of the crash, which occurred in Russian airspace, Azerbaijani President Aliyev has also called on Russia to take responsibility for the disaster. Aliyev reportedly told Putin that the plane was hit by external interference while over Russia and has demanded that those responsible be held accountable. He has also said that the plane had been mistakenly shot down and that its GPS systems were affected by electronic jamming. Western experts have pointed fingers at Russia as the party responsible for the crash. US officials say that there were early indications that the Azerbaijani plane had been shot at from the ground. The flight was carrying 67 passengers from Baku to Grozny in Chechnya and crashed in Kazakhstan, killing 38.
Russia has declared an oil spill in the Black Sea critical as a state of emergency has been introduced in Crimea. This spill was reportedly caused by 2 oil tankers colliding in the Black Sea during a storm.
Russian authorities have been warning of severe environmental damage as a result of the oil spill. In the wake of the collision, one tanker sunk to the bottom of the sea, while the other ran aground in the Kerch Strait between occupied Crimea and Russia. The tankers were carrying over 9,000 tons of oil, around 40% of which is estimated to have spilled into the sea. Thousands of volunteers have been mobilized for cleanup, but scientists have since criticized the effort, saying that it was far too insufficient. The Russian Transportation Ministry also insists that all polluted aquatic areas have been identified and are currently being cleaned. Russia's Emergency Situations Minister, on the other hand, has been more cautious and says that the threat from the oil spill still persists.
Former football player and right-wing populist Mikhail Kavelashvili has been sworn in as Georgia's new president. The country's opposition and outgoing president have been rejecting this appointment, calling it illegitimate.
The already months-long political crisis in Georgia is becoming more exacerbated with each passing week. Outgoing President Salome Zurabichvili insists that she remains Georgia's legitimate head of state, though her term formally ended on December 29th, and she has left the presidential palace in Tbilisi. Zurabichvili claims that since her successor has been chosen by an electoral college dominated by the Georgian Dream Party, he is therefore illegitimate. The Georgian Dream came under fire in the wake of Georgia's parliamentary elections, seen by the opposition as rigged in the party's favour. Despite thousands of protests across the country, the Georgian Dream refuses to back down and even suspended the country's EU accession talks. Georgian authorities have also been very strongly criticised over the police's brutal crackdown against the protesters, which included the use of force against journalists.
Despite over 150,000 Russian war crimes being documented, some Ukrainians still struggle to break away from Russian cultural influence. Experts say that as many as 30% of Ukrainians still feel a connection to Russian culture.
A substantial number of between 15 to 30% of Ukrainians are not ready to abandon Russian language and culture. This is despite experts pointing out that thousands of documented war crimes committed by the Russians in Ukraine show the severe moral failure of Russian society. Anton Dobrovich, the former head of the Ukrainian National Memory Institute, says that those Ukrainians who are hesitant to give up Russian ties often tend to seek compromises. These include ways to normalize the presence of Russian culture in the country. What's more, these people also represent a potential voter base for pro-Russian candidates. Meanwhile, just in spring 2024, a survey showed that 2/3 of Ukrainians overall are in favor of removing Russian language from official communications. Prior to that, 58% of respondents also said that they no longer viewed Russia as necessary to Ukraine.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.